Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin. I have a very special guest today, Dr. Abdallah Rothman, who is a colleague, a friend, and he's also a licensed professional counselor and also an instructor and therapist in the burgeoning field of Islamic psychology. Abdallah is part of the International Association of Islamic Psychology. The link for that is islamic-psychology.org. We'll have that in the description of the show. He is also part of a counseling from an Islamic theoretical orientation certificate program that will be held in Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University this July 2018. The link of that program will be in the show, as well as information on their website. It looks fascinating. If you're in the field or interested, check that out. Registration is open. I met Abdallah last February 2018 at the Conference for Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology in Los Angeles, and we really hit it off. And one of the things that struck me about Abdallah was his spiritual quest as a young man and how he became Muslim. So in today's show, we're going to hear this amazing story, and inshallah, we'll have him back on again soon to talk about Islamic psychology as a theory and as a practice. So stay tuned for that. 1 week until the holy month of Ramadan, which I always say is the month of self-diagnosis, of the year where our nafs, or ourselves, really get purified, it gets checked, and we get a better sense of what good or bad habits we've cultivated throughout the year. So inshallah, we'll be coming back with more themes on how to optimize spirituality in Ramadan. But I think this show is a wonderful start. It's also Mental Health Month here in the United States, so it's just wonderful how all this is coalescing. Hope you enjoy the show. Please don't forget to visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. Support the show, give generously, help us keep this running if you have benefited. And thank you for tuning in to the Coffee with Kareem podcast. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Kareem. I am joined today by Abdallah Rothman. Abdallah, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Abdallah Rothman, that's an interesting name. Why don't you tell us more about that name?
Yeah, so that's like the most recent version of my name. I have I have several names that I've accumulated over time. So Abdallah has been with me for, I've been going by Abdallah for, I'd say 13 years now, I think, since I embraced Islam. Before that, I was Ezekiel.
Wow.
Yeah, that was for between, ages 29 to, between ages 18 to 29, I was Ezekiel. And then before that, I was Eric. And ironically, now that I live in the Muslim world, so when I was in the US, I went by Abdallah. I actually went, like in my practice, it was Abdallah Ezekiel Rothman. And then when I came here to the Middle East, they are very into official documents. And so you have to go by what's on your birth certificate. So whereas in the US, I went by Abdallah, now that I'm in the Muslim world, I go by Eric, which I haven't gone by since I was 17 years old.
So tell us more about what you do.
So I do a lot of things, but I would say the central thing that I identify with is that I'm a counselor and a psychologist, meaning that I study psychology, but from an Islamic paradigm. So my approach to everything I do really is seeped in that, in Islamic psychology, and so I would say that's what I do. But then I have many different projects and jobs and things going on related to that.
SubhanAllah. And those of you listening, Islamic psychology is what helped Abdullah and I meet for the first time. Couple months back, we met in Los Angeles at a conference on Islamic psychology, and it's just such an amazing story and place to meet somebody. Ezekiel, Eric, Abdallah Rothman, one day just crosses paths with Karim Sirajuddin from different corners of the planet. And what brought us together is our passion for Islam and psychology. So I just wanted everyone to know that. That's where we connected. And Abdullah shared a wonderful story with me about his journey to Islam. And we're going to get to hear that right now. So get your coffee ready.
All right. Get your coffee. Basically, from a very young age, I was really driven by and intrigued by spirituality and religion. But I wasn't given a religion, really. I mean, I didn't grow up in a religious family, and so I had a lot of freedom to choose my own path. And my parents weren't necessarily spiritual, and so I guess that made my being intrigued with spirituality, it made it even that much more clear and what I was looking for, because I felt like I didn't have it. I wasn't given something. And so I sort of set out on this sort of journey of finding the truth and studying many different religions. And so I would do that, some by books, like I would read a lot, but also I traveled, and I found myself in lots of different places, basically living and practicing with people. So I would go, the way that I traveled is I would go with like a very small day pack, and I would just like, oftentimes I'd fly a place with a one-way ticket and really have no plan of when I was coming back. And on very little budget. Like I think somebody, I said I traveled around the world for like a year, or I circled the world. I didn't necessarily go everywhere in the world during that time, but someone asked me like, wow, that must have been so expensive. And this is in like 1999, so things were cheaper, but in 1 year, I spent $2,500, including
Wow.
airfare. So I never paid for a place to stay. I very rarely paid for food. I basically just would show up places and open my heart to
SubhanAllah.
people. Uh, and like I found that just by putting down this barrier of being, an outsider, a lot of times people come to a place and it's foreign, and they function like a foreigner. There's this like, well, I'm different, you're different, and suddenly there's this barrier that is very hard to break down, because there's this conceptualization that you're on different sides or you do things differently. And so I was in a place of like, I don't know, I had this ability to put those walls down and really connect with people on a heart level. And so what would happen is I would get sort of delivered to different people. Like people would sort of take care of me and say like, oh, well, I'm going here, let me give you a ride. And I would just find myself in these places, oftentimes in the spiritual community with some
Wow.
teacher. It was always there. I always found some like elder teacher. So for instance, in Jamaica, I lived in the hills with this Rastafarian family for a couple months. And the guy was this old, sort of very well-known Nyabingi elder, very spiritual, not like what people think of when they think of Rastafari. They think of smoking weed and they think of, just reggae music, but it's a very much more spiritual orientation. And then similarly, I went to Thailand, and I found myself in the jungles of Thailand living with a Buddhist family. I stayed in Palestine with an old man, and I was a shepherd for 7 months. I lived in an open barn on a bale of hay as my
Wow.
bed.
This was a Jewish family or a Jewish farm?
Yeah, yeah. This was a Jewish man, but then I also would go and I would learn and study Torah with him, and then I would also travel and to like other places and study with. I stayed with the Black Hebrew Israelites.
Wow.
It's a community in Dimona, in Israel. Um, and then I also spent a lot of time with a Hindu, this guy Baba Haridas, and I studied pranayam, breathing, and yoga. So this is over like I'd say from age 16 to all the way to um, 25 or something like that.
Wow. So how did you manage to get all these excursions and adventures like between age 16 and 25? Were we talking like summer vacations or you would take a year off of school? I mean,
Yeah, it was yeah, in between. I took a year off, so I would travel like in the summers or in between high school and college, and then in college I would travel a lot, and then in between college I took a year before I went and did my master's in psychology. Um, and like I said, I spent very little. You know, I would work. I was always working and saving up money to go. But then also there's a reality of the fact that I grew up in a privileged situation where I was able to travel that much. You know, just that I had the privilege of having parents that would allow and encourage it, and that I had just the money when I worked. I didn't have to provide for my family. I would work and save that money for myself, and this was really just a priority for me in life. So
that's great. So it's fascinating, Abdullah, because you started off by saying, from this age of 16 on, there was a part of you that recognized on some level that there is something called the truth, right, with a capital T, because nowadays that is not necessarily clear or obvious to a lot of people. Like, truth is more relative. There is no absolute truth. But there was something back then or during these years of your life where you recognized there was something you were looking for. Can you tell us more about that? Like, that's a very interesting drive just to have. Like, why leave your life and wherever you were and decide, I want to go travel and find the truth? Like, what did that even mean to you back then? Like, was it a true religion? Was it true philosophy? Was it finding if there is a God or there isn't? I mean, tell us more about what prompted you to be so adventurous and curious.
yeah, I mean, now looking upon it, I can't say that there's. I think Allah just put that in my heart. I couldn't explain how I had a sense of the truth, but it was like this innate, um, almost like compass inside of me that just knew when something was in line, in attunement with like how it's supposed to be, and when something was out of alignment. And I wasn't searching for God, to be honest. I completely 100% believed in God. I used to say I don't believe, I know, like Carl Jung said at one point. It was just, to me, it was like an absolute reality, but I didn't have I didn't have like a dogma attached to that. It wasn't a God that was given to me in some sort of structure or form or explained. It was something that I perceived and felt on a very deep level of certainty. And it was at the time, I was really into religion because it talked about that stuff. Like it talked about this unseen world, this unseen reality, the sort of transcendent understanding of the human experience, and that there's more to life than just sort of the capitalist drive to sort of be happy and accumulate stuff.
So, Abdullah, you studied with Rastafarians, with the Jewish tradition, Buddhism, Hinduism. What else did you study deeply along these adventures? And after you answer that, what made you decide to like move on? And how come did you find truth in God with all of those different traditions? Why or why not?
Yeah, I felt like when I would be with these people and be studying and practicing with them, my my in, my way of being with them was as if I was one of them and like a believer of whatever it is that they believe. Because to me, that was true because in my perception, I believe in one God. I believe in one truth. And so even though there's this multiplicity, my perception was like, this is just people doing things and making sense of that reality in their way. And so when it enabled me to fully do what they're doing, because I'm a believer. I'm on this path, meaning this path, meaning the path of truth and God. And so I would um, I would be there and fully in it, but then ultimately the reason I wouldn't stay with a one particular place or religion or path is that a couple things. I felt like there was probably more than 75% of what they were doing I felt was in line with my compass, that compass internally in my heart that said this is truth. But then there was always like a few things that were off, mostly like, either culturally or theologically, the way that the people had structured and understood their, sort of religion. And then the most impactful thing, what sort of sealed the deal for me of why I would move on in each place, is that there's always this commonality where there was this air of, well, if you're not doing what we're doing, then you're lost. Like your soul is not saved. If you're meaning like practicing our way. And as soon as I felt that tinge of
Exclusivity. Yeah.
judgment, it's not like they were judging me. It was more like it's like if this is the path, there's one way of doing this. We have determined that this is it, and if you're not on that path, then you can't possibly be being guided by God. And to me that wasn't in line with my compass, that in my truth, because to me it was all about this internal state, and that only God can know that truth of a person's heart. And so as soon as I felt that, I would be like, okay, well, you're missing something. There's something you don't have there, because you can't possibly know what is inside of me. And so it wasn't until at that point, I got to a point where I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to sort of conglomerate all these things into my own path. Take from here, take from this group of this tradition or this religion, because this makes sense to me. I like this aspect, and put it all together and sort of assemble my own path. And then soon after that, I was introduced to Islam. Like I hadn't really delved into that yet.
How old were you at this point?
I was
So you were introduced to Islam at around 28, 29, and you never really considered it before that.
no, like it hadn't not I hadn't spent time with it, and so, alhamdulillah, I was the people that I was introduced to Islam by were holding it in the right way, I would say. And so it was the first time that I felt from a group of religious people who they were following their path. They were praying 5 times a day. They felt like you're supposed to do that, and yet the way that they were with me is that they allowed me to potentially be on a higher spiritual plane than they.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning like they didn't have this idea that like, well, if you're not doing what we're doing, then you're lost. Then your soul needs to be saved or something like that.
That you're lost or that you're less, perhaps.
Yeah. It was like I could potentially, even though I'm not doing what they're doing, I'm not Muslim, I'm not I don't believe in this path necessarily, they were more interested in looking at my heart. And in my heart, they could see that I was like somebody struggling for the truth, you know? And so to them, that was what was most important. And they sort of allowed that, you know, God can know what's in my heart, and that it's not really for them to know. And there's a potential that I'm on the right path.
Where did you meet these Muslims? I want to go live with them. They seem far in between these days, unfortunately. I mean, not saying they're not there, but they're out there. MashaAllah, we do have a lot of wonderful people like that, but that's not always the feeling that I think many people would get if they just visit a local masjid, especially as a non-Muslim who's just like curious, right? I don't know if that's the type of vibe that would happen. Some places probably, right? But seems like there's more work to be done. But keep going. This is really fascinating and just so beautiful to hear.
Yeah, I think I was blessed to meet to find Islam through this way. And I think, you know, whenever people ask, like, well, how did you become Muslim? Or how did like I didn't become Muslim. Like Allah led me to this path. And so this is you know, I think this is the only way I would have been able to see what Islam truly is that it being held in in the right way, in this way. And to me, it connected with the whole reason why I was interested in spirituality in general, but religion or religions, is that I saw them potentially as a path to um, doing the work of um, spiritual growth, of self knowledge, and that work is the primary objective of a religion, you know. And so when they held that in that way, where they looked at me and looked at the work that I was doing internally and the state of my heart, and that was more important than the behaviors or the external you know things that I was doing or aligning with, that's what sort of was this epiphany for me of like, this is what I've been looking for all along, is that religion to me wasn't the religion. I think there was a time when I was rejecting the external, the path, because I saw so much disparity in people not holding it in the right way, you know. And so I was like, okay, you know, it's supposed to be about doing this work of self growth, but then it becomes about this external, you know, in group, out group thing. That wasn't as important. For me, I always thought that the religion, the external behaviors and rituals and practices, were only supposed to deepen that internal work on the self.
Right. It's like an anchoring for your internal reality, or yeah, which is what you see in the seerah too of the Prophet ﷺ, right? The first 12 years of the seerah was all about theology, the inner work, social justice, and prayer wasn't revealed until I think 11 or 12 years in, right? And alcohol wasn't forbidden until after that. So a lot of the anchoring or the structure of the religion didn't happen until Medina, which is very interesting too, because it's kind of like, I think, reflecting what you experienced or what you went through. But let me ask you this, Abdullah, because there might be some people listening going, okay, that's wonderful, but, you know, don't Muslims believe that if you're not Muslim, you're lost, or sometimes even less? And what would be your Islamic psychological response to something like that?
I would say that I think people get confused with what human beings have deemed the religion of Islam and the concept of Islam.
Hmm.
You know, I think people tend to follow this sort of non-Islamic view of religion, where their approach to it is that it's somehow you can have vicarious salvation, and that's not an Islamic concept. There is no way that just by believing in a religion or believing in this way that your soul is saved. That's not Islam. That is some other. There's perceptions of other religions like that, where if you believe, if you're a believer, then that's good, you're good, you're set. That's what's going to save you. But in Islam, from my understanding and how I've been taught, is that it's about working on yourself, and that you don't just get it. You don't just the day that you say Shahada, you're good and your soul is saved.
Right.
You're saving your own soul on a momentary basis, because Islam is a state. It is not something that you just sign up for and now you get your membership card and now you're going to go to Jannah automatically. It's work that you have to do continually and refresh this work so that your Islam is refreshed. You have to be in a state of Islam daily, and you can fall out of Islam from moment to moment.
Yeah. I mean, Muslim is a verb in Arabic terms.
Yeah.
Right? It's active. It's not like you said, a state. It's not fixated or static. It's something that evolves as you do, right? And you're supposed to evolve. That's the whole point, because all the themes of the Quran, from my understanding, is about, growth and purification and transformation and turning back and staying on the path and expanding knowledge and so on and so forth. So, I mean, yeah, it's like sometimes you do meet people who have this idea of, I've signed up for the membership, I've memorized the creed, I know all the answers because it's in the books or it's on the websites or this guy or sheikh said so, and that's it. There's no more else to figure out. There's no quest. I like to see it as like there's no existential quest, and I always like to describe the Quran as, an existential text, because it gives you guidance and nur and light about what existence is all about, people to people, person to God, person to themselves, and that's existentialism, right? How we cultivate meaning and awareness and growth and realizing you're an ever-changing self, right? You're not static. And this is very important, because when we don't think about it in that way, I think you'll see a lot of what you're describing here, just kind of staying stuck with this illusion, or I almost kind of see it as the idolatry of Islam, which is something I have written about, where Islam is no longer about a sincere relationship to the divine in this inner cultivation, but rather can sometimes become an ego-building endeavor, or a group or political validator. And that's what it's about for some people, which is really sad and scary. And that's perhaps what can turn off even people who are born Muslim, right? They see that, and it just rubs them the wrong way. And then they create this real negative association with the religion and the lingo and all this stuff. And I'm wondering if you had any advice for people like that who've basically had trauma or negative stigma associated with these types of Islamic organizations or outlooks, or even their own families, where they're just like, I don't know if this is really what it's about, because it doesn't sit right with the heart of the compass of the heart, as you described it. Like, we all have that perhaps indicator within ourselves.
Yeah. I don't know. I think maybe we have to have like a born again Muslim organization, or not organization, but designation, because I think people need to find Islam on their own. I find a lot of times people who are born into Islam, they hear my story and they're so inspired by it, and it's like, whoa, like, how did you went through all these things, and chose Islam in a world and in a family, and that was not only not encouraging it but opposing it. And so I think people need to do that. I think people need to seek to a certain degree. I'm not suggesting, people are given Islam as a huge blessing, and I think in a lot of ways perhaps Allah knows, or not perhaps, definitely, Allah knows what people need, and He gives it to them exactly and how they can handle it and what they need. But for some people, they're given this huge blessing of given this clear path, but they still need to do the work of understanding what that is and seeking that truth for themselves, you know? And I think that if they if people could reorient their relationship to Islam and see it not as this thing that if you don't do these things you will then be lost, and see it more as, okay, these are guidelines that will help you deepen your own personal work. But it has to be reframed as like it's work. You have to work on yourself. That's what the whole religion is based on, essentially. It's about um, learning to know yourself, and knowing God is through knowing yourself. Knowing yourself is knowing God, and that if they don't embark on this journey of self-reflection and self-knowledge, then you don't understand Islam. You're not really practicing Islam in the way that of why it was given to us for, you know? You're like, you've embraced the external things that are supposed to deepen that work without actually involving in that journey internally.
Right. Almost like we got to see it as a toolkit or an instrument to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the divine, rather than see it as kind of its own end product. Right? It's like that's how a lot of people may approach it. It's like Islam is an ends to itself. It's like its own ends product. It's like, no, it's all of that knowledge that you study, and the tradition and the people that have gone forth, all we're really reading and learning about is how they've done their own inner work using Islam, right? I mean, when you read things like Abu Hamd al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina or Ibn Arabi or whoever you're interested in from the past or the contemporary, I mean, a lot of that brilliance is about how they reflected and expressed and found Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Islam as a toolkit or as an instrument, you know? And it's like one of my teachers said, we busy ourselves too much with learning about the legends of our deen instead of becoming our own legends by using the same exact tradition that they did.
Yeah, or we take this approach where we look at those legends and we just sort of put them on this pedestal instead of emulating them. You know, it's like again this vicarious salvation. Like, it's like, okay, well, if you just look to Jesus as being, you know, the savior, then like that's all you need to do. But instead of like, no, I think I think Isa alayhi salam even would have said himself that the whole point is to emulate this behavior. And so this is what Islam gives us so beautifully in the Sunnah, is that we're supposed to emulate the Prophet, and not just, you know, read about him and say, wow, mashallah, he was so perfect and amazing. And then I tell people this sometimes, they're like, well, I could never be at that level. Like, no, you can't. You'll never be at the level of the Prophet, but that doesn't mean you don't try. The whole point is that you have to use that as a goal, or as the potential that we have as human beings. Then you emulate. You do your best to align yourself with that model. That's all it is. So, and this is exactly how I came to Islam, was through psychology, and this is sort of where psychology comes to it with me, is that I had just, first of all, when I was looking at all those religions, it was from the lens of this understanding of psychology as the study of and of the soul or the self, and then this path of growth, self-growth, self-knowledge. And that's to me what psychology was, and that's what I thought all religions were really at their core. And so after I've completed my master's in psychology, my whole time I was doing my Western psychology study, I was always inserting God and spirituality into it all, because to me it was like a conventional way of talking about the heart of what these spiritual paths are for, is working on the self. And so it was through looking for a system of spiritual development in a religious context, or in the context of God, I would say, that I found Islam. I was actually looking for, like, literally looking for like a science of the soul that I could apply to my practice of psychology. And that's how I found Islam, is through really this science of the soul. And then it all sort of came together for me spiritually, and everything I was looking for was all contained in Islam. And then simultaneously, the sort of way that I wanted to practice and understand psychology was contained in Islam. And so for me, they're one and the same, I see Islam through the lens of psychology, and I see psychology through the lens of Islam.
Beautiful. How are we doing on time, brother? Should we? We've been going about 40 minutes. So, did you want to talk more about Islamic psychology and the importance of it, and then we can go into our closing segment? Okay. So, Brother Abdallah, you are one of the individuals that I know who is dedicated, passionate about Islamic psychology as a discipline, as a practice, and you're working on your own, research regarding this subject matter. But I'd love to hear more about why you believe Islamic psychology is important in our times, and especially for Muslims. This is something that I think you and I have discussed about how it's kind of lacking from the curriculum of some organizations, not all, but some. And it isn't something that you would normally hear about at like the local masjid, right? As like we actually have a discipline of Islamic psychology, or ilm al-nafs. And now, of course, mashallah, we're getting more kind of traction with Muslims, especially in the United States and elsewhere, kind of going into schools of psychology and getting degrees, becoming therapists, this and that. But they are, of course, studying from a Western paradigm, which has, of course, its benefit and its use. But there's also a lot of paradigm building blocks, if you will, that begin from the beginning with very different ideas or conceptions of reality, and of course, what is the human condition? What are the parts of the human condition? What is considered healthy or unhealthy, pathology or not, etc. So, do you find that as a Muslim community, especially in the West, because that's where we're from, we need Islamic psychology as a real discipline, as something that we can provide for our community as a way to heal the specific members of our community? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think for me, it's so much broader than I think a lot of people are used to thinking about psychology or mental health as a field, because oftentimes it's seen as it's for people that really have major problems and aren't like high functioning, right? And so for me, there's definitely a way to treat, I would say, or address that issue within the Muslim community through Islamic psychology. But if we were to bring it even wider, I would say that, and sort of building off of what we were talking about in terms of, Islam being this really path about self-knowledge and having to do the work. Allah does not change a people until they change what is in themselves. So I think the reason why it's so important to bring this concept into for the ummah is that we need to look at Islam as a resource for this process of development, and when we look at psychology, not to like pathologize everything. I see it as like a spectrum. We're all sick. We all need healing. Our souls, just by nature of being in the dunya, the whole point is to struggle with our soul and to uncover so that we can get to what's underneath in our fitrah, and this witnessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and staying in remembrance of Him. This is the ultimate goal of life. And And in order to uncover that and to do that work that we're supposed to be doing in this life is facing ourself, working on our nafs, working on the problems. And so it could be everything from just like um, being overcome by jealousy and greed and the little sort of nafsi things that come up in your relationships that make you have fitna between people or make you, to somebody having an anxiety attack because they feel not grounded in Allah, and they're grounded maybe in this dunya, and it's throwing them out of their fitra, to some more serious what people in the West have pathologized, which is people sort of being, I would say, usually that's designated as people who are not functioning in society, and so that's where we have come to know of like people who have real mental health problems because they're not functioning in society. Well, from an Islamic perspective, functioning in the dunya, in the capitalist system, may not necessarily be the goal that we should be striving for. And so I think there's just a huge spectrum of how we can look at psychology being applicable to the whole ummah, not just people who have things that are getting in the way of their daily functioning, but maybe sometimes it's even more of a problem when it's not getting in the way of people's daily functioning, because they've adapted to this constructed self, and then really not living from a place of their fitra, really understanding and having self-knowledge. And so I think that's something that we need to address on a really wide scale within the community, because I think it can heal on multiple levels.
Thank you so much for sharing. So what I heard you say was really interesting. In Western psychology, there's this idea of being functional in society. So in other words, if you're meeting the needs, expectations, fulfillment of whatever the dominant pop culture, societal, processes determine, right? Like you go to school, you have a girlfriend, you get a job or whatever, right? And as long as you're going through that kind of conveyor belt of social engineering, you're good. Yeah. But you're saying also from an Islamic perspective, the soul, which doesn't necessarily find its home here in this life, just by the fact of that being in our body and having these, physical or material needs, there's always some kind of a tension. And from an Islamic perspective, being well adjusted to society or capitalism or wherever we live, that doesn't necessarily equate to health, right? Because you could be very successful and have all that good stuff going for you, but your heart, from an Islamic perspective, could be dead or really diseased, or you're not really seeing the reality of things, i.e. that this is all in a theater of divine manifestations. And nowadays, of course, we have many people that, from the onslaught, just say, there's none of that is real and relevant. There's no such thing as metaphysics, as God, as religion. Life is just science. It's about, what you make of it. And, this is the flash of life that we all get. So, do what you got to do and don't feel guilty, kind of thing. So, I mean, there is a huge spectrum here as you're discussing. And I think it's interesting that you said that as Islamic psychologists, we shouldn't necessarily just assume that treatment, quote unquote treatment, is only for people who have, let's say, some particular serious problem. But I'm also hearing you say that we need to just have we need to have psychoeducation, if you will, about ilm an-nafs, about Islamic psychology, about understanding how these parts within us work. Allah talks about different dimensions of ourselves, and many of us aren't even aware of those terms and what it implies and how it impacts us, right? Like you use the word fitra. Some people might not even know what this means, right? Or nafs, or aql, or qalb, or fu'ad. I mean, all these types of terms. And so, I think that's a really good reminder that you pointed out.
If we're talking about Islamic psychology in the form of what we've known in Western psychology to be like you go and you see a therapist and you go to therapy, with this model, then I think we should we shouldn't be afraid to all assume that we need to be going to therapy, because essentially we need to be working on ourselves. And often it helps to have somebody guide you through that process of self-reflection. If, part of that is somebody who's trained to have the tools to help you go through that process, but also having another person hold up a mirror to reflect to you. Because if it's just you doing it on your own, you tend to fall into traps of, shaitan messes with you too. Like, oh, you're doing great, don't worry about it. Or, you don't see your faults, you don't see where you need to address something. And so having somebody hold up a mirror to you in that process of Islam, of deepening your Islam and being a Muslim, being in a state of Islam, of surrendering and working through the places in your heart and in your soul that keep you from surrendering, then, like, to me, that's why we're here. We're not here to, like, accumulate accolades from different professional organizations and be popular and have a bank account or memorize things, from books. We're here to work on our soul and uncover our soul. And so, to me, the reason why I became a psychologist is because I want to do this. This is what I feel like I'm supposed to be doing in my life. And I do need a career. So what better way to try to make a path for myself and make a career is, like, helping other people in this process. And it doesn't mean that, like, because I've arrived, I'm now gonna, like, show them the way. It's that I'm still doing this work constantly. I have to keep doing it. So it's a joy for me to sort of be on that journey with other people and say, because I love it, because there's nothing else I want to be doing other than, like, uncovering my heart and getting in a deeper state of witnessing Allah and remembering Allah. And so why do we have to exclude that to only when there's major problems that get in the way of our functioning in life? Like, I don't think functioning in this life, in the dunya, should be our end game, sort of our measure of success or our measure of health. Health to me should be a much broader perspective that includes akhirah. Like, is your soul healthy? Are you satisfied with the state of your soul to get to that place on the day of judgment? And if not, like, people think of that as, like, oh, well, then I need to go, I need to fast more, I need to go to the masjid, I need to read more Quran. Yes, you need to do all those things. But all those things are there to help you deepen that process of uncovering what is covering over your fitra state in your soul, in your heart. And that takes work. That takes looking at yourself and holding up a mirror. And so why can't we all benefit from that process? Why are we secluding it only to people who have quote unquote problems? I think we need to reframe that and recognize and accept that we all have problems. We have lots of problems, and we need to be encouraged to admit that and sort of have the understanding that's part of the process of being human. That's part of the human condition.
Abdallah, it's been amazing to hear your journey to Islam and the passion you have about Islam and psychology. And may Allah bless you and your family and all that you do. And we're going to close out our conversation with Karim's 5 fun questions. Are you ready? Question number 1, Abdullah. If you could have a free pass to eat at this type of cuisine for a year, which one would you want to choose? What cuisine?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was Ethiopian.
Really?
Yeah, that might be because I had Ethiopian food with my wife yesterday for her birthday, and it was amazing.
But that's your favorite.
Can I give you 3? I'd say Ethiopian, Jamaican, and Japanese.
MashaAllah. That's a cool mix. All right, I'll give it to you. That sounds good to me. All right, question number 2. If you could travel anywhere in the world, next week, all expenses paid, where would you want to go?
See, the all expenses paid part sort of changes it. Because I would have said Medina or Sudan, because for me, Medina is just sort of spiritually where I would go in general, but Sudan is really my spiritual place personally. That's where I feel like my spiritual family is. Um, but I don't need money there.
I love it. That's great. Okay. So either Medina or Sudan, mashallah. Question number 3. If you could be any animal for a day, which one would you want to try?
I feel like I'm not answering any of these just straight up, but hopefully that's okay. My favorite animal is a lion, but I don't necessarily think I would want to be a lion for a day because that would be. It seems like I would feel lazy. Like I don't like laying around. I like doing stuff and moving around. So I think it'd have to be a bird of some sort.
You're such a psychologist, dude. All right, how about this? If you could have a cup of coffee with any Muslim from the past besides the prophets or the companions, do you have one specific that you can think of? If not, then I'll let you choose a companion or a
I can't
prophet.
remember his name. It's like Baba Boop something, but he's supposedly the guy who brought coffee to popularity. I think in Yemen. Um, so coffee was originated in Ethiopia, and then it was discovered there, but then it was really brought to the world in Yemen. And from what I understand, he was a Sufi sheikh, I think, who basically they would drink coffee to stay up at night in dhikr. And so I would want to drink coffee with him because it's like the origins of coffee, and I would like to know sort of like what was going on at that time that it was used in this like this aid to a spiritual practice, and now it's given birth to this sort of in some ways mindless like drug addiction culture, and so the connection with that, bringing it back to that spiritual place, would be really really fascinating for me.
Yeah, episode 3 of the Coffee with Cream podcast is called Wine of Islam and Sufism, and I talk a bit about the history of coffee and this order that used to practice the coffee and in their ceremony of dhikr, if I recall correctly. But yeah, very fascinating. Okay, question number 5, Abdullah. If you could have one superhero power, which one would you want and why?
Okay, I think my superhero power that I would want is yaqeen.
Ooh, that's a first.
Because I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you why it's a or I conceive of it as a superpower. Is if you have yaqeen, which means certainty in Allah, like basically this absolute 100% knowledge that Allah is the one, and this witnessing of Tawheed, then my belief is that if you were standing in that yaqeen, you would have all of the superpowers available to you, because all of these things like reading minds and flying, and all these things are things that we think of as superpowers because they're beyond the limitations of the physical world. And I believe that the only thing keeping us from doing those things is yaqeen, is having certainty in Allah. And if you had that, I believe you would be able to walk through walls and read minds and fly and all of these things. So, yeah, yaqeen, man, I guess would be mine.
SubhanAllah. I'm wondering how many people think the psychologist is crazy now.
Well, the carpenter's door is always broken.
Right. No, but I totally get where you're coming from. I mean, that's the first time I heard anyone say that. So bravo for the originality. But yaqeen, the certainty in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being so grounded, so connected, so anchored in the divine power, which is unlimited and can do anything and change the atomic structure as we know it, yada yada. That is, like you said, it's like that's you plugging into everything. And everything can be, altered or changed when you're connected to that source. So from that perspective, of course, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
The only thing keeping you from that in this separation is this, feeding into this illusion that we're separate and that we're bound by duality in this dunya, But everything is one. It's all tawheed. So essentially, it's accessible.
Dr. Abdallah, thank you so much for your time today and your insights. And I hope, inshallah, that God blesses you in your efforts and your journey moving forward. And thanks again for your valuable time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Next time, I would like to have coffee with you in person.
That's wicked cool, man. Yeah, inshallah. Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor this show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.